Jackie, the book of Jeremiah is obviously about a figure named Jeremiah, who I think we assume was probably a real human being. But in any case, the book is set in a very particular time and place, and Jeremiah is a very particular kind of individual. What's the historical setting for this?
So just to backtrack a little bit, I think it's sort of illuminating to think about how in the Babylonian Talmud, the way Jeremiah is depicted is in the way some Bibles have ordered. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, which is not chronological at all, but actually in terms of character. So Jeremiah would be all doom.
Yeah.
Ezekiel would be half doom, half consolation, and Isaiah all consolation. Now, while that's not entirely true, it does set the tone for understanding what we are to expect in these multifaceted compiled works in the book of Jeremiah, what we call the book of Jeremiah, which has many different genres within it, and of course, as you say, set in a very particular historical setting. So what we have here is a figure, a prophetic figure, whose career lasts from, I think it's the 13th year of King Josiah's rule up until the installation of King Zedekiah. And so in that historical backdrop, this prophetic figure, whose career would have spanned 4 decades, covers the dissolution of the Assyrian Empire, a kind of brief period of independence of Judah, and then the specter of the Babylonian danger. And so it is appropriate to call him a prophet of doom because everything horrible that he predicts comes to pass in a certain sense.
Now, is that to say that he was like a really good prophet? Like he saw the future well? Or is it to say that he was a realist and he looked around and he was like, oh, this is going to be bad?
So I think in some senses he is a lot like Isaiah in the sense of a court, like playing the role in some sense of a court prophet. Of course, he was banned from entering the temple. So, maybe a court prophet on the wrong side of politics. And also, I don't think anyone really appreciated his message, as we will see in thinking about the very strange narrative about Jeremiah and his scribal apprentice Baruch and the scroll that they write and that is burned and that they have to rewrite. So he is a figure who has an idiosyncratic message, and it's not one that everyone likes. And he seems to be very strangely both at odds with the program of Josiah's reform, but also using all of the language of the Deuteronomistic theology.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because you alluded earlier to a sort of multifaceted, multi-layered, multi-authored text. I think often when we think about prophetic books, we kind of assume, oh, you're just like, these are the words of the prophet, right? I'm getting a report of what the prophet said. Now, in some prophetic books, that's easier to buy because all you get is like a title. It's like, in whatever year, this prophet said this, and then you get a book and then it's over.
Yeah.
And Jeremiah is like, it's prophetic oracles and first person stuff, like the word of the Lord came to me and I said. But then there's there's other stuff. There's Deuteronomistic stuff. There's narratives about Jeremiah in the book of Jeremiah. It's
actually the most biographical prophetic work that we have. And yet at the same time, it's really hard to pin down who this guy actually was, which gives you a window into how non-biographical actually prophetic texts are. Like they're the way that these words attach themselves to a speaking character is not in service of telling us who they were, but rather how who they were was kind of part of an experience of the divine word in the service of speaking a kind of truth, often an inconvenient truth, about how God's law plays out in history. So of course, Jeremiah, in many ways, like Ezekiel, believes that that Israel has irrevocably destroyed the terms of the covenant. He has some problems, even though he doesn't directly address King Josiah's reform. He has clear problems with the implications of that reform. Would you like me to read a little bit about that?
Would you?
Okay. So, and I'll get back to the call in a second, but he has this sermon, and I should note that there are a variety of genres in Jeremiah that make it a complicated work to read. There's poetic prophecies, there's prose prophecies, there's biographical information, there's laments for Israel, there's laments for himself, and then there's sermons. And this is a sermon, the famous temple sermon in Jeremiah 7. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord: stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah that enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and let me dwell with you in this place. Now, what do you think of when I say in this place?
Presumably the temple, the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies.
Right, which recalls the Deuteronomic program of centralizing the cult in Jerusalem. And also, it alludes to Josiah's reform, which we see in this discovery of a scroll they're remodeling the temple and oh, surprise, we found a scroll. And actually the prophetess Huldah tells us, we have not been following any of the rules that are outlined in this scroll, which is the covenant between God and his people Israel. So we're in deep trouble now. So in a certain sense, Jeremiah is referring to this reform in which other sort of cultic practices are eliminated and the cult is centralized at Jerusalem in this place, which is an important language from that reform. But Jeremiah has a very particular critique of this. So he says, do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly one with another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. Here you are, trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are safe, only to go on doing all these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? You know I too am watching, says the Lord. Okay, so the message here is pretty clear. Okay, great that you've eliminated all these other cultic practices and centralized everything at Jerusalem, but the minute you walk into that centralized place does not absolve you of all of the moral crimes that you're involved in.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a wonderful passage because it is, in a sense, it's taking the standard sort of trope from lots of the other prophets, this like what's often understood erroneously is this like anti-cult, right, sacrificial, what need have I for your sacrifices, which shows up in all of these earlier prophets. Instead, and the message for all of those is essentially the message of this, which is like sacrifices that are offered as if they're going to absolve you and as if that's all that's needed. But meanwhile, you're out doing all these terrible things to other human beings, right? It ain't going to work. This is taking that idea, and then instead of sacrifice, it's like centralization.
Exactly.
Right? And so in a sense, it really does do this wonderful like macro cultural critique of like, even of Josiah, right? Like you think, oh, like I just did this one thing and now I get to do whatever.
Yeah, that doesn't absolve you of all of the crimes of Manasseh. Or perhaps after Josiah, and like with this we don't have a lot of information, but how long did Josiah's reform actually, persist? Did they immediately go back to, venerating, other cultic images?
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly Ezekiel will have much to say about that.
Yeah.
And I think the language here is also really important because he is using the language of the Deuteronomistic theology in order to make his message that is actually counter to that reform, right? So he's critiquing that reform, but using the same language.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, in the same way that the anti-sacrifice polemics aren't really anti-sacrifice, this doesn't read to me as really anti-centralization. It's just, but it is a way of saying like,
it's not enough.
It's right, necessary but not sufficient.
Exactly. And so what he says here is, go now to my place that was in Shilo. So this is also a language of instruction, which is the same kind of language that Deuteronomy would use,
Mm-hmm.
right? Go to my place that was in Shilo, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. So learn from the cautionary tale of Shilo, right? That is a shrine that is now defunct,
mm-hmm.
that remains as an empty, defunct shrine as a lesson to people about what happens when you do not maintain the terms of the covenant.
And not just any shrine, right? The shrine where the ark was.
Exactly.
So when we think about this, so he's giving this message, presumably, I mean, it's early in the book, presumably in response to, in the reign of Josiah, in response to the Josianic. But it's the Babylonian incursion, like onto the scene, right? The arrival of this epically powerful, like worse than the Assyrians.
Like you thought the Assyrians were bad, right? They were child's play.
Right. And I mean, what's, like, can you set for us the scene of like the world at this point? Like he's looking up at this Babylonian threat. What's that threat look like? I mean, what's happening out there that he should be so scared?
I mean, we have, three major world powers here. I mean, of course, like the sunsetting of Assyria, the rise of Babylonia, and also the specter of Egypt. And I think that, Israel is constantly trying to figure out, well, Judah specifically, where they fit on the scene, who they should ally themselves with, if that is even acceptable. What do you have to say about Jeremiah's position as a kind of political go-between?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's really represents exactly what you talked about, which is this like trying to figure out where we sit. We have to understand, in the wake of the Assyrian Empire, they've just witnessed the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. So like they know what that looks like, right? Which is to say, they know what standing up and pushing back looks like, and like failing to, kowtow to whoever the empire in charge is. And I mean, Judah knows this too, right? They've gone through their own like near destruction. So do you ally yourself with? And this is Jeremiah's, right? Like, do you ally yourself with those who are fighting back against the empire? Right? Now I sound like Star Wars. But like, are you they're Ewoks. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I know the lore well enough. But they're, he's looking up at Mesopotamia, at Babylon, and he's like, to fight that is death. And yet, I feel somewhat wrong to not put up any resistance. And I mean, we'll talk in the next section about like how he negotiates that particular thing. But Egypt is sitting down there as this, as you say, this alternate power, and we've already had decades of prophets being like, maybe not Egypt. Like, maybe let's not go hang out with them, right? Like the broken reed of Isaiah, right? The notion that like if you start relying on these other foreign powers to help you fight against this, like the real big bad guy, it's just going to go really badly for you.
Although, I mean, at a certain point, and I guess we'll talk about this, Jeremiah basically says that God is on the side of the Babylonians.
Right, sure. Right, absolutely. And that's what I mean about this, like this negotiation of like how to understand and reckon theologically and historically with this this political landscape. Jeremiah, a priest?
Okay, so the initial superscription of the book is kind of confusing in a certain sense. So I will read it for you, right? The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah. Wait there. Which Hilkiah are we talking about? We're not talking about the priest in Jerusalem. We must be speaking about some other Hilkiah, right? Or maybe not. I'll get to that in a second. Of the priests who were in Anatot in the land of Benjamin. So he's from the periphery, in a sense. He's 4 miles northeast, I can't remember it, 4 miles away from Jerusalem in the north, west or east, I can't recall. But it is an area that's sort of like between desert and fertile land. So in his language, in his imagery, you'll see a little bit of that, like, his in-between space of desert and fertile land, and he's able to bring that up. But also the fact that he comes from a priestly line, but is he from an exiled priestly line from Abiathar?
I mean, it's a little bit weird, right? What are we doing? What are priests doing not in Jerusalem once Josiah has centralized?
Well, there's an older priestly line that Solomon had taken out to Anatot, so we know about that. Are they hanging out there?
But the point is, I think what you're getting at is like he is a sort of a liminal figure, right? He's a priest, but he's not that kind of priest.
Exactly.
He's a court prophet, but maybe not that kind of court prophet.
And he's a son of Hilkiah, but not that Hilkiah,
yeah, exactly.
Which I think is sort of like another important point. And I don't know if this is meant to be, if it's meant to cause the reader to question his identity in a sense, like already from the get-go. I mean, it could just be, it could just, just happen to be the case that like it was just another Hilkiah. But also the term for son of Ben with reference to a prophet is not entirely clear that we're talking about a son, right? It could be
a member of the class of.
A member of the class of, or an apprentice of, or part of a school of thought. So we're already presented with a kind of liminal figure who comes from a priestly line, but not that priestly line, who's a son of Hilkiah, but not that Hilkiah, who's not from Jerusalem, who's from Anatot.
Who's living between Babylon and Egypt, between Assyria and Babylonia.
Exactly.
So all that plays into it. And so, in our next session, we're gonna talk about like how he deals with that space.